Dear everyone, it's such a pleasure to present today on the topic of evidence ecosystems and learning health systems. What are they and why bother? This is, of course, a topic that is of great interest to me, as I think you will see during the presentation. Let me just share slides, and there we go. So I have different employers, but for the purpose of my presentation today, it's fair to say that I represent the Magic Evidence Ecosystem Foundation, which is a nonprofit based in Oslo, Norway. It's a pity I couldn't come to Bergen and meet you, but here I am stuck in my home office. In terms of declarations of interest, I am the co-founder and CEO of Magic, and I have no financial conflicts of interest, but I may have some intellectual conflicts. I'll leave that for you to decide during the course of this presentation. Now, what I'm going to talk about the next 30 minutes, also to inform the plenary discussion, is from a evidence-based medicine guideline and Magic perspective. I will present what I believe are great advances both in standards for guidelines, methods such as GRADE, processes to move to even living evidence and guidance, and platforms, how technology could help to move from new evidence to improved care. I'm going to talk about the journey for Magic and how we came to this point where we are obsessed with the evidence ecosystem. And I'll go into more details about current problems with evidence, siloed evidence, from its production to impact on care. Then I'm going to talk about the evidence ecosystem models and learning health systems as potential solutions to these major problems. And I'll end off by giving some examples of how we in Magic and our network of people work to enhance the evidence ecosystem, also to highlight some remaining challenges. And the pictures to the right shows these loops that we will talk about in this session, exemplifying these evidence ecosystems. I'm going to start out with a clinical question, a scenario. This is a patient I call John. The picture is from Google. This guy wonders if he needs a cocktail today. To be more specific, he's hospitalized in a hospital in the Oslo region with severe COVID-19. He struggles with breathing, and he has read in the newspaper that he would benefit from an antibody cocktail called RAIN-CoV-2. At the same time, in North America these days, lots of patients eat horse paste. Again, to be more specific, this is the drug ivermectin that has caused quite a lot of attention in the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, these are questions that emerge at the point of care. And of course, clinicians and their patients, they would need trustworthy decision support to be accessible and understandable at the point of care. Organizations, those who develop guidelines and other tools for decision support, need to apply best current standards, methods, processes, and perhaps even technology to deliver decision support to the point of care. The question for today and for this conference is whether we need evidence ecosystems to make sure that John and his fellow patients get the right treatment at the right time in 2021. So I'll come back to this clinical question, but first I'm going to go 11 years back and talk about how we got started with this work, resulting in an evidence ecosystem model for us. In 2010, I was postdoc at McMaster University in Canada, and I spent 3 years to create guidelines for antithrombotic treatment. We were 128 experts spending 3 years to create an update of these antithrombotic guidelines from the American College of Chest Physicians. In 2012, they were published in a journal called Chest. You can see here one of the chapters on cardiovascular disease. I was the methods chair for this guideline panel, and I really became very enthusiastic because I felt we had great standards for trustworthy guidelines and we had the great methods. So we could create guidelines we can trust, but my deep concern was how to use these guidelines in practice. Imagine you have a question about treatment for your patient, and clinicians only have 2 minutes before they give up finding an answer to such questions. Well, you find this guideline in PDF. You have to scroll down 60 pages to find the right recommendation. And if you want to have a look at the evidence underpinning the recommendation, you have to go vertical. This shows how the grade summary findings is in vertical format. Of course, I have a laptop, so I actually could have a look at this in a vertical way, but it doesn't work. So this was the starting point for everything we do in MAGIC. How could we improve guidelines so they work at the point of care as decision support? At the top here is the title of a paper published in Lancet a few years ago from Gordon Guyett and Ben Julbegovic, describing progress in evidence-based medicine a quarter century on. This is my favorite textbook, The User's Guides to the Medical Literature, showing how clinicians and patients now can share evidence and have discussions about what is best for the individual patient. So this is just one example of what represent major advances in standards and methods for guidelines and evidence-based medicine. And you could say the same for evidence syntheses and other parts of evidence-based medicine. I'll talk you through some of these advances in the next few slides to give you a bit more detail. Standards. Well, in 2011, the Institute of Medicine in the US published standards for trustworthy clinical practice guidelines. These standards delineate that guidelines are statements that include recommendations intended to optimize patient care. Perhaps that's not a big surprise, but more importantly, they are informed by a systematic review of the evidence and an assessment of the benefits and harms of alternative care options. Now, this is important. This table shows the specific standards describing how the guideline panel members need to be free of conflict of interest, how we need to critically appraise the evidence and rate the certainty, how we should provide clear recommendations with the strength, etc. These standards are very clear and important to the field of guidelines. Unfortunately, most guidelines do not meet these standards. And this is one example where we have some organizations who actually appraise and filter the trustworthy guidelines from the others. As an example, this is the ECRI Guideline Trust, and you can find scorecards where they have gone through the standards, and this particular guideline is scored as trustworthy, and this is a guideline on opioid therapy for patients with non-cancer pain. I'll show you this guideline in a minute in MAGIC app. Methods. Well, I think you all have heard about GRADE, and I won't take you through the details. But of course, if you use best current methods for how to critically appraise evidence and systematically and transparently move from evidence to recommendations, this also impacts on the process. This is just one example of how you can use GRADE and MAGIC app as a platform to move from clear questions in PICO format to make GRADE evidence summaries and move from evidence to recommendations with the evidence to decision framework and then published recommendations. But it still typically takes maybe 3 years for a guideline to be updated and published, and maybe it's not very easy to find either. Which again is one of the reasons why we in MAGIC had to create this platform that you may also have heard about, the Magic Authoring and Publication Platform, Magic App. Now, again, lots to be said about this platform, but it means that guideline panels enter online using their account, and they create the entire guideline content in digitally structured formats, from the PICO questions to the grade evidence summaries to the recommendations and other important information, all structured and tagged in the database. This means we can publish in new formats. I'll give you examples of what we call multi-layered formats on all devices, finding recommendations first, then drill down. Plug recommendations into practice through electronic health records, for example. It should be easier to adapt the guidelines, for instance, an international guideline to a national guideline, or in a local protocol, reusing the evidence and the content. To the far right, we have tools for shared decision-making, automatically produced from grade evidence summaries. And up to the left, we have the arrow saying new evidence, dynamic updating. The idea was back in 2011 that if there is new evidence, we should just update that part of the guideline, because now the recommendations are the entities, because it's not longer a long PDF document being the entity. Now, the arrow to the left is important because it has resulted in a breakthrough for living evidence and guidance. I'll come back to this later in this presentation. This just shows a picture of what guidelines look like in this platform called Magic App. This is the opioids guideline from Canada, now being updated. It's from 2017. It gives a strong recommendation to not start with opioids, test other treatments first. If you want to find the research evidence, you click on the tab here. You could also click on the rationale or practical information or decision aids, but you could click and find the grade summary findings in an interactive format like this. So for all recommendations, you have the patient-important outcomes like pain, you have the relative effects, the absolute effects, the certainty in the evidence, and the plain text summaries. Again, aligned with the Trustworthy Guideline standards. Now, this is all good, but we need to get to the topic of this talk, which is evidence ecosystems. So how did this come about for us? Well, in 2013, we had launched Magic App, but we felt increasingly troubled because who cares about guidelines published in better formats, available on all devices, etc., if they do not result in improved care? And challenges for evidence go way beyond guidelines for both patients and society. This picture shows some silos, and if you start out to the far left, the evidence-based research community are experts on detecting problems with evidence production. And you know that most research is waste. It's not reliable, not relevant for clinical practice, at least. In the next silo here, we have the evidence synthesizers. Well, unfortunately, there's a mass epidemic of flawed and useless systematic reviews as well. To the next silo, here you have those producing guidance, health technology assessments, guidelines, maybe decision aids. They struggle hard to base their recommendations and guidance on systematic reviews. They try to do their own rather than working with the evidence synthesizers like Cochrane to produce targeted updates of systematic reviews to feed the recommendations. And then to the far right, we have the implementers, the quality improvers, the medical informatics people, all those trying to implement evidence into practice and evaluate impact on care. And we do work in silos. So this is really a big problem, which is why Magic in 2014 came up with what we called a digital and trustworthy evidence ecosystem. Again, with our perspective, we set out to create a conceptual framework and a model with the ultimate goal to increase value and reduce waste in healthcare and research. I'll take you to this in a bit of detail, because wouldn't it be great if there is more reliable and relevant research evidence from trials, cohort studies, qualitative research, big data, even real-world evidence and artificial intelligence. We do need more relevant and reliable evidence. And I think that's where the evidence-based research community has its key focus, at least up until this date. If this evidence is produced, it should flow seamlessly into evidence syntheses and systematic reviews that even are living, relevant, timely. Then this evidence should feed into health technology assessments, clinical practice guidelines, again, seamlessly, and serving the needs of, for instance, a guideline panel who phrased the PICO question and requested evidence syntheses and even subgroup analyses for their needs. Now, the guidelines and the HTA reports and decision aids would then be published in nice and user-friendly formats globally, worldwide, ready for adaptation and reuse at each and one country and healthcare system. At the bottom, we had the crucial step of implementation into practice and evaluation of impact. So how could we use decision support systems in the HR, registries, and other mechanisms to improve care and actually measure that we can have an impact on delivered care? But it doesn't stop here. It goes round and around and around. This should be followed by production of new evidence, again, ideally, embedded in registries as randomized controlled trials or cohort studies, and feed this loop that would gradually see better evidence to inform care in a cyclical process. Importantly, such an evidence ecosystem will never work unless the actors explicitly agree on some common standards we talked about, some methods, improved processes, and how we work efficiently together and share evidence, and technology and digitally structured data should even further facilitate and make the process more efficient. So this is a vision we had back in 2014. Now, in 2016, we had been working with organizations and we felt a bit frustrated because they struggle to change their work they do. So we thought, do we really need organizations to move from new evidence to trustworthy guidelines that are disseminated into practice? And we started a project to test if we could just be a network of people, the best clinicians, methodologists, patient partners without conflict of interest could actually do this work better than organizations and faster. This is the BMJ Route Recommendations Project that you may also have heard about. And we went to the journal BMJ and established a partnership to do this part of the evidence ecosystem better and faster. And we published about 21 guidelines, moving from new evidence to published guidelines within 90 days was the goal for this project. And you can read more about this, but it shows how we could work more efficiently and in evidence ecosystem by breaking down current ways of organizing our work. This shows how, this is a video on how the rapid recommendations work, and you can have a look later at the website. Another thing we focused on in Magic was to build strong partnerships with actors in the evidence ecosystems. And this would warrant both shared visions, a culture, and trust to collaborate. So we entered a partnership with Cochrane in 2016 within this evidence ecosystem. And then we also started working with something called the Australian Living Evidence Consortium linked to Cochrane to do living systematic reviews and living guidelines. And we'll come back to this later in this presentation. It just shows how we try to establish clear partnerships with organizations dealing with evidence and guidance. Sorry. Moving to 2018, I was made aware that there's going to be a series of papers in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology about evidence ecosystem models. And I was asked to write a commentary on these models Of course, I then realized, and I was not surprised, to be honest, that there were several evidence ecosystem models out there. So I'll take you through some of these models and discuss what are their similarities and potential differences. Here to the left, you can see a paper from the Italian GIMBI Association and Antonino Cartabellotta is heading this society in Italy. They host the Sicily conferences in evidence-based healthcare every second year. And here's their model. It's called the ecosystem of evidence. And it says it cannot thrive without efficiency of knowledge generation, synthesis, and translation. The picture shows the same cyclical process of evidence generation, synthesis, and translation. It's a very nice overview of different initiatives and organizations working at these different steps of the evidence ecosystem. Another series of papers came from the French Cochrane group. Having succeeded with the network meta-analyses, they describe in 3 papers what starts out to focus on evidence synthesis ecosystems to a full evidence ecosystem. And in the 3rd paper, they provide this picture. It shows how you could do living monitoring of trials, and then you could move to living network meta-analyses, living guidelines. So a very specific focus on evidence synthesis and guidelines moving into a living fashion. Then we have more evidence ecosystem models, of course. This is the evidence synthesis ecosystem from the Cochrane collaboration, showing how they work to improve their systematic reviews. Quite a lot of complexity here, and I'll not take you through all the details, but it is nicely aligned with the bigger evidence ecosystem, but again, focusing on that part, evidence synthesis. The Joanne and Briggs Institute have a very nice model called the Wheel of Evidence, very similar to the digital and trustworthy evidence ecosystem, nicely covering the implementation step, which always has been a core focus for JBI. And finally, I was happy to find the evidence ecosystem model from the evidence-based research community. Again, a bit similar to the Sicilian model, where you have all these different actors and organizations working at different steps of the evidence ecosystem. Now, then in this paper I wrote up with Lynn Brandt, the Magic App Mastermind, and one of the co-founders of Magic, we went through these different models and we conclude as follows. We all come from the evidence-based medicine society, but we have slightly different perspectives. We all agree that there are problems with evidence at each step of the evidence ecosystem. The great emphasis is on solutions for evidence synthesis and to some extent also guidance, but a lot of emphasis on evidence synthesis. It is much less clear on how we solve problems on the knowledge translation step. So implementation of evidence and guidance into practice, followed by evaluation of impact and even production of new evidence. That's where I think we all struggle to provide clear solutions and demonstrate progress. Then Lynn and I went to the US and met with the Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research in 2018. We were invited to talk about our evidence ecosystem because they were doing learning healthcare systems. And a long story cut short, in 2007, the Institute of Medicine published a nice roundtable on evidence-based medicine called the Learning Healthcare System. The figure to the right shows a visualization of the learning healthcare system. To make it a bit simpler, this is the original figure from buddy Chuck Friedman, who made this model. It shows a loop with an afferent side in blue and an efferent side in red. The blue part is where the key focus is on the learning healthcare system. It's how do we assemble and gather data from practice? How do we analyze that data and interpret the evidence in what becomes the efferent part, which is the implementation into practice, evaluation, and impact. The other big emphasis learning health care systems have is on decision support in the HR. We're working with HRQ in a big project now to see if we can understand each other. For us, this is a great match with the evidence ecosystem models. But again, the question is, how do we actually succeed in improving care through such a model? So I'll round off with a few examples how we think it is possible to enhance the evidence ecosystem. I'll use 2 examples in doing so. You heard about drugs for COVID-19, so I'll come to this with some answers to you. But first I'm going to talk about arthroscopic surgery for shoulder pain. The picture to the left shows that surgeons like to do arthroscopic surgery. Now, the question is that if that is a good idea to offer patients today. So this is what happened for the case of shoulder surgery, where we thought a few years ago we could close the loop in Norway. At that time, in 2018, there were 2 sham trials showing that such surgery only had a placebo effect. We did a systematic review and synthesized the evidence to confirm no benefit. It was followed by a BMJ rapid recommendation, with a strong recommendation against such surgery. At the same time, the health minister in Norway launched a project to de-implement or disinvest in useless surgery. So we thought we could work in Norway with the big regional hospital trusts who were charged to disinvest in such treatments, with the national HTA system at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, and used the National Health Atlas, which indeed showed great variation in practice for such shoulder surgery, to close the loop. But 2 years later, perhaps because the COVID-19 pandemic hit, we haven't been able to close the loop. So how do we do this? We're actually going to pursue this in a new project in Norway right now. Now, again, coming back to COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic and combined infodemic has been a breakthrough for living evidence and guidance in this evidence ecosystem to learn from. John had a few questions. How about getting trustworthy guidelines disseminated globally quickly for the questions he had about this antibody cocktail and others who may wonder about ivermectin? We probably do need to work within an evidence ecosystem to make sure he gets the right treatment at the right time in 2021. This shows our vision that has partly come through with the COVID-19 pandemic. We work in this evidence ecosystem, and we are able to produce or support the production of living guidelines with the World Health Organization, NICE in the UK and Australia for COVID-19, and in Australia also for the other topics like stroke and kidney disease. But for COVID-19, here's what's happening. We're daily monitoring new trials for COVID-19 treatments. There's a team of 50 people at McMaster doing living systematic review and network meta-analyses, so high quality evidence syntheses. They feed the guideline panels at the WHO and other organizations with targeted evidence summaries within a week or 2. Then the panel makes recommendations using grade, and it's published in Magic App and the BMJ accordingly. Actually, Australia succeeded back in April 2020 with living guidelines for COVID-19. And then NICE came along and did this from this winter. But the question is still, how do we implement the new evidence into practice? It is indeed very difficult. So if I had even more time, I'd give you details about how these guidelines look like in Magic. And here you can see the evidence summaries. Here's the living systematic review, a separate challenge in itself. Here's the living guidelines for Australia on their wonderful portal where you could find flowcharts and click and find all the evidence recommendations. But to round off, we do have a lot of remaining challenges. To give you a final example, MAGIC now want to do living guidelines for diabetes drugs. There are a lot of countries and organizations keen to join. In this case, there's so many trials, more than 700 trials, more than 400 patients showing that 2 new drugs are highly effective for those with diabetes because it reduces cardiovascular and renal outcomes. So how could we use this evidence ecosystem to go all the way from new evidence to guidelines published and available at the point of care, but not only available at the point of care, actually improving care? Well, in short, it warrants many factors to be in place. The actors need to explicitly agree on and make use of these specific standards, methods, processes, and platforms. It's a huge challenge. So to summarize, we made great advances in evidence-based medicine and guidelines. These standards, methods, processes, and platforms allow us to work within a much more well-coordinated and efficient evidence ecosystem. These different models have many similarities, but they have to some extent varying perspectives and maybe also competing interests. I think the future holds great promise if we could work together in such an evidence ecosystem. And I'm curious to see how the evidence-based research community could help to solve the remaining challenges. And thank you so much for listening.